Hi, I'm Drew, and I'm an amateur model builder. I'm building a layout in my basement based on the Frisco Railroad in the Ozarks. In this episode, I'm going to be scratch building a mill for my layout. In this episode, I'm going to be building a mill from scratch. Now this mill will be placed near a stream on my layout, and the stream will be coming from a spring. Now this is the first time that I've ever done any scratch building, so I'm excited to try out some new materials, some new tools, and some new techniques. So let's go ahead and jump into it. I started my planning by searching for some prototypes to base my build on. My search turned up an old mill in Ozark County, Missouri, near the town of Thornfield. It was built in 1907 and operated through the 1940s. I like this mill because it is simple and rustic and fits the time period I am modeling. Although I am not building this to match the prototype exactly, I did want to get a rough estimate of the size of this mill. I started by tracing the outline of the building. Then I measured all the main dimensions on this outline. Now it's time for some math in my White River Line planning journal. To begin with, I need to get an estimate of the scale of the photograph. I was guessing that this front post on the porch is probably 8 feet tall. This post measures 3/16 of an inch in the photo. I divided the 96 inches in 8 feet by 3/16 of an inch to get a scale of 1 to 118. The height of the mill in the photo is 2 5/8 inches. Multiplying by my scale, 118, gives me 309 3/4 inches, or 25 feet 9 3/4 inches. The width is 1 1/4 inch, or 147 inches, or 12 feet 3 inches. Finally, my depth was 2 9/16 of an inch, which gives me 302 3/8 of an inch, or 25 feet and 2 3/8 inches. Okay, well, what about perspective? The further away something is, the smaller it appears. This is easily seen on the vertical lines on the drawing. The front edge is taller than the back edge, but this effect also occurs on the horizontal lines. 10 feet in real life on the front part of that horizontal line is longer than 10 feet in real life on the back side of that horizontal line. To really be accurate, I'll have to account for that in my calculations. The back edge of the prototype in the photo has a height of 2 1/4 inches. This yields a scale of 1 to 146 on the back of the mill. Averaging these two scales out, I get an average scale of 1 to 132 along this perspective. Applying this scale to the measurement, I get a length of 338 1/4 inches, or 28 feet 2 1/4 inches. Because of perspective, my estimate was off by about 3 feet. Not a big deal in the long run. Applying this same formula to my width, I get a corrected width of 13 feet 11 1/2 inches, a distance of almost 2 feet. This error will make a bigger impact. I'm also concerned about getting the dimension right on the peak of the roof. I again average the scales from my front and back edges to come up with a scale for this midpoint. The estimated height at the peak of the roof is 32 feet 1 1/4 inches. Despite all this precision, Okay, well, maybe faux precision. I'm going to go with nice round numbers. A height of 26 feet with 32 feet at the peak, a width of 14 feet, and a depth of 28 feet. I'll also need to account for the alcove on the side, but I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. If I were a more experienced modeler, I might be able to sit down and start cutting out my panels, but I didn't quite trust myself to do that yet. So I sat down and drew out the pieces that I'd need. In particular, I wanted to get the layout of the windows right. They're a little bit janky on the prototype, and I wanted to clean that up. As I drew out the parts, I felt like the proportions I'd pulled from the prototype weren't quite what I was looking for. It looked a little too narrow to me, so I widened it by 3 scale feet to 17 scale feet. I estimated by eye that the windows were about 2 feet by 6 feet, but as I drew it out, I didn't like these proportions, so I changed them to 2 by 5 feet. You'll notice that the top row windows are shorter. I modeled these at 2 feet by 4 feet and laid them out with spacing that looked good to my eye. I estimated the alcove at 7 feet wide by 10 feet deep and 12 feet high at the roof line. I'd need to adjust the placement of windows on the side of the building with the alcove, but I'm a bit anxious to get started on cutting out the panels, so I'll do that on the fly. The material I'm using for this model is styrene. It is a material that I'm used to, and it is pretty easy to work with. I began with the easier panels to get used to this process, and then moved on to the more complex cuts. I'd recently picked up this low-profile square from Micromark, and it makes cutting out these pieces a breeze. The nice thing about working with styrene is that you can just score it and then snap the pieces off. I didn't have quite enough of the clapboard material to get all 4 major sides of the building. Another trip to the hobby store is in the works. When preparing to make this structure, I found a couple of really great YouTube videos that really helped me out. In particular, I found a great video by Adam Savage, who has a great series called Adam's One Day Build, where he shares a lot of his experience as a model builder for Lucasfilms. After cutting out the panels, I cut out the space for the alcove on the right side. Then I moved on to cutting out the holes for the windows. I chose to cut these out on the back to avoid overcuts on the front, and because I anticipated navigating the ridges on the front would be a little difficult. This took a bit more patience and precision with the scoring. I found that cutting them out from the back caused some tear out on the front as well. Well, nothing that a little filing can't fix, and it should be easy to cover with the trim for the windows. Hammond Mill was built in 1907 in the town of Hammond, Missouri. It was in operation as a grist mill until 1940. After the mill closed, it fell into ruin for several years, but it has since been restored as a private residence and lodging for hunters and fishermen visiting the area. After cutting out the panels, I moved on to manufacturing the windows. There are a total of 39 windows on this model. I could have saved myself a lot of work by buying windows. However, the prototype's windows don't have any divided panes, and I wanted to stay true to this detail. I began by building a jig to construct the windows on a piece of cardstock using balsa wood. I actually built quite a few to try and figure out the best material and form. This is the one I landed on. Using the jig as a guide, I began sizing the framing for the windows. I'd recently purchased a Chop-It from Micromark as well, and it made cutting out the numerous pieces I needed pretty quick and easy. To build the frames, I put in the sides first, and then wedged in the tops and bottom pieces. I then applied a small amount of cement to each corner. I chose this adhesive because it welds the styrene together, but with minimum adhesion to the wood and paper jig. Once the joint is relatively set, I remove the frame and set it to the side. Applying the trim to the frames was a little more difficult. I did experiment a little bit with cementing the trim while the frames were in the jig, but there was too much surface area and it was difficult to remove them from the jig. I was left to manually align and cement the trim to the frames. After building the windows, I set about to install them in the panels. However, I quickly realized I should probably wait until I did my base painting before installing them. This would make the painting easier. Prior to painting, I wanted to fine-tune the holes for the windows and the panels and get them the right size. The X-Acto knife and sanding sticks were all that were needed. Well, that and some patience. Sizing this particular hole took me almost 10 minutes, but most went quicker than that. Since I changed my strategy on painting, I figured now was the right time to build the front door and the cupola for the top of the mill. Doorways in most houses are really only about 6.5 to 7 feet tall. I looked at the door size on the kit builds I've already made, and on these models they were 8 scale feet. So I went with 8 scale feet. I sketched out a design for the door and set to work cutting out the front panel. In constructing the door, I used 040 styrene and built the rails and stiles from the strips I'd use for the trim on the windows. I used a small piece of 2x4 scale dimensional styrene strip for the dividers in the window pane on the door. This was the same material I used to build the window frames. When designing the cupola, I estimated the size by eye and fine-tuned it by drawing it out. Once I had the size figured out, I used the gable ends of the buildings to get the angles right, and then cut the pieces from the scraps I had left over from cutting out the door. There was one more detail to add to these panels. To paraphrase Bob Ross, in my world, the alcove was a later addition to the building, and they had to move a couple of windows as a part of this remodel. Backwoods construction being what it is, they chose just to board over the holes in the building that this created. I set about building these boarded up windows with some 2x4 dimensional strip styrene and glued them into the holes that I had cut earlier on the right side of the building. These types of details add some storytelling depth to a model, and it creates additional interest. With all my pieces cut, it was time to move on to paint. As usual, I applied a light gray primer prior to paint. For the windows and smaller pieces, the airbrush tends to blow them all over the place. As I was trying to find the right material to keep these pieces in place as I painted them, I found an old beanbag toss game from my son's 3rd birthday. We had painted it on sticky back foam core. He's 14 now, so we probably won't need to use this game again, and this would be the perfect material for keeping these pieces in place. I placed the pieces on the foam core and blasted away with the airbrush. Once priming was complete, I was ready to put on the base coat of paint. I chose burnt red for the main color and deck tan for the trim. On the couple of panels that I'd already installed the windows on, I needed to be a little more precise with my painting, but painting the other panels went a lot faster. Once the panels were complete, I painted the smaller pieces while still attached to the sticky pack foam core. This way I didn't need to hold tiny pieces as I painted them. This went rather quickly as well. Once the paint was dry, I glued the windows and doors in place. I then moved on to glazing the windows. For the window glazing, I grabbed a piece of clear plastic packaging out of the recycle bin. This package has a nice flat top. I sized and cut strips to go horizontally across the line of windows. I figured this would give me more gluing surface and would make the work go faster. I experimented with a few glues. PVA glue, also known as Elmer's glue, as well as CA glue, also known as super glue. The PVA glue has a nice long working time and dries nearly invisible. It can work really well for glazing in a lot of cases. However, in this case, the long working time wasn't an advantage. The back of the panels were a little uneven, so I had to hold it for a long time to keep them stuck down to the back. In this case, I went with a medium thickness CA glue. The thicker consistency provides more control and still has a relatively fast working time, around 5 to 10 seconds. The town of Hammond served as an economic center for the farmers in the area. In addition to being a grist mill, it also powered a saw and a threshing machine. Hammond had a general store, a drugstore, a bank, a post office, and a few blacksmiths. There was even a distillery. Now that all the sub-assembly was completed, I glued up the panels. I used the medium thickness CA glue instead of the styrene cement. Styrene cement strips acrylic paint, so if you're not real precise with it, it can make a bit of a mess and ruin the model. CA glue doesn't do this. And if I make a mess with CA glue, it can be pretty easy to cover up. A flood in 1948 cut a channel away from the mill, and changing times caused the town to flounder. Now there are very few people living in the area. I glued up the roof by placing the pieces on top of the construction to get the angle as accurate as possible. At this time I'm only gluing the roof pieces together, but not to the building itself. I'm considering creating some interior details and lighting in the model later down the line, and keeping the roof separate for now will make the work easier. I'm also going to use some weathering techniques on the roof that require it to be kept separate for the time being. You may have noticed that they still just have primer on them. With the roof finished, I have come to a stopping point on this model. In addition to weathering, I will need to attach the trim to the corners, and I will build the foundation and porch at a later time. I'm also contemplating building a water wheel that may or may not be motorized. Well, thanks for joining me on this episode. Overall, I'm pretty happy with my first scratch build project, and I've already got a few more planned. As always, if you've got any feedback or suggestions for me, leave those in the comments. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at White River Line, and you can find me on Facebook as well. I've got all those links below. I invite you to subscribe to my channel and to like this video. And if you click on the bell icon, you'll be notified when I upload my next video. In the next episode, I've got kind of a unique project. It's a 40-foot boxcar that's been converted into a cement car. This cement car will service the concrete factory that I'm planning to build for my layout. So join me next time as I continue building the White River Line.